Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you all for coming out on a kind of a crummy day. But it's never a crummy day when you have Adam Sieminski speaking. So we're really honored and pleased to have Adam.
What is it, a day without sunshine?
Yeah. Those I haven't met, I'm Guy Caruso with the Energy and National Security Program here at CSIS. And I know Sarah Ladislaw is in the program, but she allowed the disabled to take place this morning. I'm recovering from knee surgery, so I'm pleased to be here after hobbling around for the last 6 weeks. And especially pleased to be able to introduce a good friend and colleague, Adam Sieminski, who we've been working with both personally and here at CSIS for a number of years, and he's now almost 4 years into the job at EIA as administrator, and previously had spent some time at the National Security Council and a long career in the financial securities and analytical business, almost all related to energy. I think Adam and I go back into all the way back into maybe the 70s when you were with NatWest, yeah. And we're especially happy to be able to host the EIA's latest version of the International Energy Outlook. It's, I guess, Adam may go into some background on it, but I guess it's been a couple years since you've released an IEO, and so it's been probably more difficult this time than in previous versions. So we're really looking forward to some of the innovations and the changes that the EIA team has worked so hard on for this version, and it comes at a time when obviously there's a great deal of interest as to where do we go from here after a period of now a couple years of lower than average oil prices, and where are we headed? And no one better to tell us about that than Adam, and present the work of EIA. Adam has really done an outstanding job at EIA, and at a time when the market has been going through one of its transition periods from the last 4 years. Of course, we've had $100 oil and we've had $20-some oil, and the resurgence and renaissance in U.S. energy has really been a challenge to EIA. And I can speak from watching the innovations and the leadership that Adam has brought to EIA, and at a time when we've seen this resurgence, and it's required a lot of, I think, innovative thinking. It's required a lot of management challenges to change the way EIA collects data, and especially in the unconventional. And Adam's done an outstanding job with that. And so with that, Adam, I really appreciate your being here once again to share your insights. Thanks.
Okay, Guy, thanks a lot. I think I'll use the lectern, and that way I can see everybody in the room better. Turn that on. Everybody can hear now? Great. Well, Guy, thank you very much for the kind introduction. It's always a pleasure to be here at CSIS. I've known John Hamry for a long time, too, the head of CSIS. But Frank Verastro and Sarah Ladislaw are really good friends, true professionals in every sense of the word when it comes to looking at energy issues, and it's a delight to be here. Let me just mention, before we get started on these conclusions, that A lot of work has gone into this. It's taken us a little bit longer than we thought to get this out. We are trying to do more modeling and more sophisticated modeling in the International Energy Outlook. Now, we've done that for years in the U.S. Annual Energy Outlook, the AEO. And the AEO will be out starting in mid-June. But the IEO, because EIA really doesn't have any authority to collect data internationally, we rely on the countries themselves and third parties for this, and we've been trying to improve the level of sophistication in our international modeling, and some of these conclusions reflect that. So it's getting better, and I think that it's been worth waiting for. People like Linda Doman. Linda, stand up so everybody can see. Linda Doman, Paul Holtberg, Angelina LaRose. Angelina, stand up so everybody knows who you are. These people have worked very hard on getting all of this out. Angelina was just recently promoted to be the head of our international office at EIA. And of course, all of this is ably led by John Conte, the assistant administrator for energy analysis. So it's kind of an interesting thing, isn't it? It all comes down to people in the end. You can have process, you can have technology, but you have to have people who like what they do. And I'm thinking, Guy, back to your introduction. 4 years in, I still actually get up in the morning and I'm happy to go to work at EIA, so that's good. All right, let's go through some of this, and we're going to leave plenty of time for Q&A. World energy consumption, we think it's going to go up 1.4% per year. So between 2012, that's our base year, that's for this purpose, between now and 2040, 1.4% per year is going to essentially increase by about half the amount of energy consumed globally. We see population growth a little bit slower than the 1.4% per year, so energy is growing faster than population. And one of the reasons is industrial consumption is continuing to go up, and industry uses a lot of energy of all kinds, and it still accounts for way over half, 53, 54% of total energy consumption. And as economies and populations grow, people want manufactured goods, and so industrial use rises. Renewable energy is actually going to be the fastest growing of all the energy sources, 2.6% per year. Interestingly, nuclear grows pretty fast as well, 2.3% per year, and its contribution will rise from something like 4% to 6% of total energy use in 2040. Even with this growth in renewables and nuclear, fossil fuels will continue to be the dominant provider of energy in 2040 in our reference case, supplying something like 3/4 of the world's energy use. Now that's down from a number that was close to 84% in 2012. So fossil fuels are diminishing, but they're still going to be pretty important. Among the fossil fuels, natural gas is growing the fastest. Coal, we believe, actually will plateau. And that will be particularly helped along as China shifts from a industrial-based economy to one that's more services-oriented. There's also a lot of activity going on worldwide that will tend to constrain coal use. By 2030, we actually see natural gas surpassing coal as the world's second largest energy source. If you kind of look at the base year for 2012, coal provided something like 40% of the world's electricity generation. Renewables and natural gas each accounted for something close to the low 20s in percentage terms. But by 2040, these three basic fuel sources will be very close, 28 or 29% each, the remainder being mostly nuclear and a tiny sliver of oil still being used to generate electricity. Final kind of concluding key finding is that with existing policies and regulations, worldwide energy-related CO2 emissions will go from about 32 billion metric tons in 2012 to something like 43 billion metric tons, an increase of about a third out to the year 2040. We are kind of at the high end, but in the range, uncertainty range of the UN's assessment of what carbon would look like in the year 2030, which they modeled. Okay, so this is the disclaimer page. So when I was in the private sector, you tended to start out with a big disclaimer page, really, really fine print. This one really gets more to not the legal issues associated with making projections, but what can go wrong. So there's lots of places that projections, forecasts, can go wrong. Economic growth, and if you thought about countries like China, Brazil, and Russia, and their importance in the global economy and some of the uncertainties associated with economic activity in countries like that, that's key. The implementation of climate policy, so what actually happens in the implementation of the Paris Agreement will be very important. And the Paris Agreement may not be the end of the story, right? It's going to continue. 2040 is 25 years away, so there's plenty of time for things to continue to change. One of the hardest things that modelers have, and EIA is certainly no exception to this, is technology. Dealing with technological changes is really hard. The onset of hydraulic fracturing, horizontal drilling, new battery technology, the improvements that we've seen already in the costs of wind and solar, and the possibility that renewables costs will continue to come down, and that storage of electricity, for example, could change dramatically and shift things around in the transportation area. All of that is extremely difficult to model. There's always the issues associated with the Middle East and oil production and OPEC issues, and nuclear energy itself has some controversy associated with it, and that's another area that I think is useful to keep in mind when you consider the projections that we are going through. Okay, so let's go through these slides. Let me kind of give you a roadmap. There's some overall slides for the world in total, and then we kind of break things out into fuels, so where we then take a closer look at liquid fuels, natural gas, electricity, and then carbon emissions. And with any luck, we'll finish this all off by 10. I'm going to give myself a half hour to do this, and we'll see where we go. I think we have the room, until 11 o'clock, Frank, is that it? So there'll be plenty of time for Q&A. All right, first slide. This is sometimes referred to, I saw Howard Grimsmith. Where's Howard? There's Howard. Howard found public parking out on the streets here. He's a Brooklyn boy who believes that it is wrong to pay. So he didn't get a seat because he was taking care of that business. There's room up front, Howard. All right, so Howard, this is one of Howard's favorite slides, actually. It's a Chi identity. You know, what is energy? And you see three things up there: energy intensity, GDP, and population. Okay, energy is a function of energy per unit of GDP, GDP per capita, and per capita's population, right? So if you multiply those all out, then you're going to get some idea of what energy is, and we start with that so what are the main drivers of energy? And the answer is, it's how much energy is being used to generate GDP, what GDP is per capita, and we know that that's growing in certain places, and then what about the population itself? So just a couple of key points here on this slide. China and India GDP per capita, still very strong growth over this forecast period. Population that you see in green is really in places like Latin America and the Middle East and Africa. And energy intensity, generally speaking, is going down everywhere. So efficiency improvements, one of the other, it's like some people like to think of that as being one of the major fuel sources. Efficiency, if you don't use it, you don't need the other. This kind of summarizes all of the fuels on one slide. You can see, let's start at the bottom and work our way up. You can see nuclear growing, as I indicated, fairly strongly, but from a low base. A lot of this growth, and we'll see in another slide, is in China. Renewables growing very strongly. We have a dotted line in there to show renewables with the U.S. Clean Power Plan included. And it changes the global numbers a little bit, changes the U.S. numbers more. And it particularly changes coal in the U.S. By more. You can see natural gas surpassing coal by the time you get to about 2030. You can see coal plateauing, and you can see petroleum still rising. Why does petroleum still rise? It's a big industrial fuel around the world, not so much in the U.S., but around the world. Oil is a huge industrial fuel. And transportation. Oil still in automobiles, trucks, airplanes, trains is still a very attractive transportation fuel. You see all those numbers adding up. So let's look at some of these things that I've mentioned in a little bit more detail. You can see this growth in energy consumption divided by end-use sectors. You can see that the numbers, the percentage shares don't change that much over time, but the overall total of energy use continues to go up, as I indicated, driven mainly by GDP and population. In this slide, what you see is that electricity generation growth, we think, will slow down a little bit. It'll end up down in the 2% range, with GDP on a global basis growing closer to 3%, kind of in a steady state situation. Those two lines, as you go out, are relatively parallel. So the point there is that electricity is tied into economic activity. But the overall numbers for electricity generation look a little bit lower than the growth in GDP, in contrast to that period back in 1990 to roughly 2010, where economic activity and electricity generation or use were growing more closely aligned. So that's going to be things like what has happened in the U.S., where electricity used to grow faster than GDP back in the 1950s and 60s, and then in the 70s and 80s it was growing with GDP, and then it started to grow below GDP. Why did that happen? The economy was changing. You had things like better efficiency of electricity use. We're now seeing that in the U.S. with things like light bulbs. Okay, so where is this growth going to occur? Largely in the non-OECD countries. We get a little bit of growth in the OECD, but in the countries outside of the developed world, energy is going to grow faster than it is in the developed countries. So we were at about 50% each in 2007 or 8. So split. It used to be that the OECD countries had more energy consumption. It crossed over last decade. We're going to have a situation by 2040 where 2/3 of the world's energy use, roughly, is going to be in the non-OECD countries. Just a little bit of, well, where is this growth in the non-OECD countries going to occur? And the answer is largely in non-OECD Asia. So it's China, India, Indonesia, a big population, and other countries like that. One of the interesting questions, I think, in looking at a long-term forecast of the year 2040, and at some point we'll actually probably shift not to 2045 but to a 2050 forecast. Maybe we'll do that in the 2018 version of the IEO. Is Africa. What is energy consumption going to look like in Africa? How much of energy consumption, how much will it grow there as the economies develop? And will it be distributed, or is it going to be centrally provided, is going to be a key question. Okay. So, carbon intensity, we see that declining. It'll decline in both the OECD countries and in the non-OECD countries. A little bit faster in the non-OECD countries as particularly the Asian economies shift more towards services from industry. But thinking back to what I said earlier, don't know about what's going to happen in places like Africa, the Middle East, and Latin America, and that could make changes, and that's why we like to model these things and look at alternative cases. Okay, now what we're going to do is talk a little bit about the liquid fuels markets. Then I'll show you a few slides there, then we'll look at natural gas, and we'll look at electricity, and then we'll look at carbon dioxide emissions, energy-related CO2 emissions, and then we'll be done. So the point on this slide is that non-OECD Asia liquid fuels consumption is going to grow pretty rapidly. Those bars at the top are going to be driven largely, as I indicated, by industrial growth and transportation growth. So knowing something about transportation is particularly important, and Jim Turner and his group are looking very, very carefully at transportation demand around the world, particularly in China, but everywhere. And we will look at alternative cases, but it's very, very important. So just a little bit of detail on that. Here's an example of passenger miles driven. This is over this period from 2010 to 2040. You can see that we believe the China numbers will grow over time as incomes, per capita incomes grow in China. But you can see similar things happening in India and Africa. Maybe just different modes of transportation, and given the kind of later start, more efficient consumption of transportation fuels will lead to numbers that aren't quite as high as what you see in the OECD countries, but that's an important part of these estimates for transportation growth. Here's another breakdown of this. How much of the liquid fuel supply is coming from OPEC versus non-OPEC producers. And if you look at the top two lines, that's crude oil and least condensate, so that's the really oily part. The other liquids are things like natural gas liquids and biofuels and others. So if you look at those top lines, I would say the key point there is that over the course of the forecast period, growth in OPEC production is still going to be needed, and in fact, OPEC supply accelerates in our model as you move out past 2025 or so. So having production possibilities in the OPEC countries is still going to be very important. Where within OPEC, the Middle East is still going to play a very strong role. So Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Iraq, three of the key countries over there, we're still expecting to see growth in output in those countries. Well, what about supplies outside of OPEC? Where are the key growers? And this one, we're going to have more to say about the United States in the annual energy outlook, which is going to come out in June. So we left the U.S. off of this slide, but countries like Brazil, Russia, and Canada are going to be pretty important in terms of growth in global supply as you look out over the period that we studied. And finally, on liquid fuels, looking at hydrocarbon liquids, refinery gain, biofuels, and so on. Natural gas plant liquids will play a very, very important role. Refinery gain, just to refresh everybody's memory, is if you measured oil going into a refinery and products coming out of a refinery by weight, you would have a little bit less weight coming out the back end of the refinery because some of it is used in the refinery. But if you measure it by volume, the way we do, barrels rather than metric tons, it's like popcorn, microwave popcorn. You put that little bag in the oven, and when it comes out, it's bigger. Right, so refinery gain adds, so that the application of refinery heat actually causes the molecular structure of the products to change, and they expand a little. So gasoline occupies more space than crude oil. I love the popcorn analogy. I hope you don't forget that one, and then you can explain refinery gain to everybody you meet at the next cocktail party. You'll be the hit. You'll be the hit of the party. Biofuels grow pretty strongly, but it's natural gas plant liquids that tend to dominate that area. Okay, let's talk a little bit about natural gas. The non-OECD countries are still will account for a significant portion, 3/4 of the growth in natural gas consumption. A lot of this has to do with the transition away from coal in electricity generation. And this is going to happen in many places around the world, and it will reduce carbon dioxide emissions by a significant amount. Let's look at where some of the growth in natural gas production is going to come from. China in non-OECD Asia, Iran and Saudi Arabia in the Middle East, the U.S., with shale gas in the Americas. Russia continues to be a critically important country in natural gas and will remain so over our forecast period. And a few other places around the world, but those are the critical countries to keep your eye on in terms of natural gas production. How about shale gas, tight gas, coal bed methane? There used to be divisions called conventional and unconventional. I think we just did a Today in Energy article last week that said something like 2/3 of the natural gas being produced in the United States is coming from these, what we used to call non-conventional. So I will leave it to you philosophers here today to tell me whether 2/3 of production can be considered non-conventional. Sounds pretty conventional to me. So we're trying to get away from that term. It's really hard. China will see a lot of growth. Canada will see growth in this. The big player is and will continue to be the United States in terms of production of shale gas, tight gas, coal bed methane. This one shows capacity additions over time for liquefied natural gas. So LNG capacity additions out to the year 2019. So this is a little bit shorter term, but what you see is the big role that blue color from Australia plays, and the green from the United States over the next few years in terms of global LNG growth. So pretty important change in things, and in fact, this pickup in growth in the United States leads to the U.S. in the very near future, later this year, next year, becoming a net exporter of natural gas. It'll be through a combination of LNG and pipeline gas exports to Mexico that the U.S. becomes a net exporter of gas. That was something that most people would have thought impossible just 10 years ago. Keep that in mind. When you think about forecasts that go out for 25 years, that technology changes, and technology can have a huge impact in many different areas. Let's talk about electricity just a little bit, then we'll do carbon, and then we're done. So this first slide on electricity markets shows the differences between the OECD countries and the non-OECD countries as far as their GDP, and these are growth rates, so GDP growth rates and electric generation growth rates in the OECD and non-OECD. So what you see is that everybody was kind of growing the same back in 1990. The OECD had slowed down, and the non-OECD was just picking up. The non-OECD numbers got very high last decade, but we begin to see those coming off. And yet we see essentially the OECD countries plateauing, with electricity growing at below the average growth rate in GDP. The same will be true in the non-OECD countries, but the overall growth rates for both GDP and electricity will be higher in the non-OECD countries. The differences diminish over time as more countries become developed and per capita incomes rise. Now, what's the role of renewables and other fuels in these markets? I indicated earlier that by the time we get to 2040, that the combination of natural gas and renewables and coal will be, in the just a little under 30% apiece, with nuclear making up most of the difference. Those numbers are quite a bit different in the base year of 2012, where coal is really dominating, but it doesn't grow very much. That's that coal plateau that we're seeing. And renewables continue to grow, as well as nuclear and natural gas. So we're moving towards lower carbon fuels across the board. What about wind and hydropower, solar, geothermal, biomass, breaking down the renewables into a little bit more visually understandable numbers. We have dominance of hydropower in the start year of 2012. Hydro grows in places like Brazil and China. The wind numbers grow very strongly here, and so does solar. So we're going to see, we believe, on a global basis, quite a bit of growth in renewables of all kinds. If you look at this from a geographic mix, it's kind of interesting how China, Europe, and the U.S. tend to dominate. I mentioned Canada and Brazil in terms of their hydro contributions. When you get to the U.S., Europe, and China, the numbers are, the fuel mix within renewables is broader. Just for reference purposes, the U.S. numbers for the start year 2012, which we don't have on here, roughly about 500 billion kilowatt hours, so the U.S. is going to grow. Europe and China in 2012 each had about 1,000, so Europe is going to grow too, but China is going to go from 1,000 to almost 3,000 billion kilowatt hours of renewables. Huge growth there projected in China. How about nuclear? In the nuclear area, you see that stunning number for China. And this is actually a little bit lower growth than we had projected in the 2013 International Energy Outlook, but the increases in electricity generation overall and use in China, and some of that coming from nuclear, will be a big part of what the energy outlook really becomes over the period. So we'll finish up now on some thoughts on carbon dioxide, energy-related carbon dioxide emissions, and then we'll do questions. So because we have overall energy consumption increasing by about a half between 2012 and 2014, a lot of that is still in the areas of petroleum and natural gas, and they do have carbon in them, less than coal, but they're still fossil fuels with carbon. We see coal contributing a substantial amount to world energy-related carbon emissions. And the share is going down, but the absolute number rises a little bit. We see that that's true across these other fuels. This is really important when you think about what the coal contribution to CO2 emissions looks like, is that the China numbers for coal consumption, so this is coal consumption in quadrillion BTUs or Qs, is going to peak and come down. There are some people that think that the peak might actually have already occurred. This is kind of a data issue. It's not easy when you look at both tons and quadrillion BTUs in China. That is, do we know for sure what the energy content is of the coal being mined in China? And do we know how much, what the actual numbers are? This is a good advertisement for the need for transparency and energy data around the world, not just China, but China is so big in its energy consumption that it's terribly important that we have good data on this. And the Chinese are working very hard, actually, to provide improved data on energy production and use. You see the U.S. numbers coming down. You see the dotted line there. They would come down. U.S. coal use in the U.S. would fall even further under the Clean Power Plan. And we see the numbers in India picking up. What about where CO2 emissions are going to come from? And no surprise, because the non-OECD countries' energy consumption is growing the fastest, and because within the non-OECD countries, the Asian area is terribly important. A lot of the growth in energy-related CO2 emissions will come from non-OECD Asia. And that is where you can go for more information on anything that I've said this morning and plenty more. We will have the annual energy outlook out, as I said, in June. Short-term energy outlook comes out every month and does a pretty good job of covering energy around the world. The monthly energy review, Today in Energy, one of my favorite things at EIA, and Guy was the EIA administrator. One before me, Richard Newell, served for a couple of years between Guy and myself, and Richard Newell started Today in Energy, and I was delighted to even emphasize it more and solidify it into part of EIA's portfolio of reports, because I think it's providing for you and for everybody a pretty good glimpse into a lot of the work that we're doing at EIA in an easily digestible format, and it's encouraging our people to think more about what's happening today, how that will influence a lot of things, policy in the near term, but also how things that are happening today can influence long-term projections like the one that you've heard from me. So thank you very much, and I'll take your questions. Yes. Do we have a microphone? Right. We have a microphone.
Hi, Allison
working.
Good with
That's
S&P
fantastic.
Global.
Say that again.
Allison Good with S&P Global. Is there a reason why you all didn't study liquefaction capacity beyond 2019?
Why we didn't study LNG capacity beyond, we actually do have estimates of that. I just thought it was kind of interesting, that short-term window where the U.S. is going to go from being a net importer to a net exporter, and some of the growth that's occurring elsewhere. And those numbers are in the IEO, and it should be hitting our website just now. Is there anybody that wants to? Michael, do you want to? Michael's pointing to somebody else. Who wants to talk about this? Wait for a microphone.
We did study liquefaction capacity. We have assumptions on liquefaction capacity going forward. So it's part of our energy outlook and it's part of our publication.
Okay. Yes.
Efkan Niftiyev, the Caspian Institute. My question is more on the U.S. LNG capacity. You mentioned the increase by 2019. Maybe you can comment on where this capacity or the exports will head to Asia or Europe. Any estimations on that?
Right. So LNG must be the hot topic today. I wouldn't have thought, actually. So I think the answer to that question is similar to the one that I just said. The numbers are going to be in the IEO. You won't see it by every individual country, but you'll see it by regions. And I'm sure our folks will be delighted if you call somebody up at EIA. They will actually answer the phone. And Jonathan Kogan, where's Jonathan? Jonathan Kogan, our Chief Press Officer, would be delighted to take your call and find you the expert at EIA that can give you the answer. So jonathan.kogan@eia.gov, and if you go on our website, you'll even find his phone number. Yes.
Hi, Chris Knight with Argus Media. So I think the last time you guys put this out was September 2014, and a lot has happened in the energy world during that time. Did you see your projections change a lot because of, seeing all this new production, all the fall in prices, or did that not change much?
Yeah, Guy
I'm
wants
glad
to jump
you
in
asked
and
that
add
question,
something,
because
too.
one of the things I wanted to ask you is that, as you said, this IEO is the beneficiary of a much greater modeling effort. And in addition to, the world changing since the last IEO, could you say a little bit more about the methodology changing and how difficult or not difficult it's been to model some of the non-OECD countries?
Right. Okay. So, and let me even come back and address the LNG questions. Why would the first two questions be about liquefied natural gas? And the answer is that if you go back to the time period in 2014, early 2014, when oil prices were over $100 a barrel, natural gas had, in places like the United States, Australia, Malaysia, Indonesia, where these are the big LNG suppliers, had a terrific pricing advantage over oil, and it made a global LNG market look very attractive. And so one of the things that's happened over the course of the last IEO and this one is oil prices are lower. They're lower in the near term. We'll have more to say about this again in the AEO when it comes out. But basically, we're starting off with a price deck that's below where we were the last time. But it rises as you get out towards 2040 to get back closer to the prior, the 2015 annual energy outlook estimates for, U.S. and global oil prices. So why does the price get back to a level that we had before? And one of the answers is that graph that I showed you, the graphic that said the need for OPEC oil looks like it begins to accelerate after 2025. You get to 2030, and so by the time you get to 2040, you still need the big three producers in the Gulf area, Iran, Iraq, and Saudi Arabia, to be suppliers into that market. Even in the aftermath of Paris, I think that our numbers suggest that growth in need for petroleum and transportation and industry is still going to be pretty strong. It could be below, what it was, and those numbers, again, could come down over time, but it's still really, really hard to compete with the energy density that's in oil. So, other things that what else changed in modeling? I don't know, Paul, get that briefcase off your desk. Linda, maybe you want to talk a little bit about some of the things that we did modeling different? Sure. Linda Doman, and she's waiting for the mic.
Thanks. So the main modeling improvement in this year's International Energy Outlook from the last time we did a full outlook, which was in 2013, was our transportation model, our International Transportation Energy Demand Determinants model, and it gives you a lot more detail. I think you'll find we've been able to do more on fuel use, and you saw the transportation statistics that we presented here, but that's the main thing. And also trying to reconcile what data there is out there on transportation use by region with what our models indicate is more likely how energy is being used in the transportation sector. And modal transportation uses so much more detailed look at that. And so I think that's the major difference. We did some minor improvements to our global oil supply, but mostly I think that's just more technically making it work better than bigger assumptions.
So, a lot better modeling in the transportation area. And one of the other things that I would mention is in transportation, I mentioned Jim Turner, John Maples, and his team looking at transportation. They used to do a lot more work on the U.S. Annual Energy Outlook, and one of the things that we've tried to do is to get the people who are doing the U.S. Outlook to also work on the international outlook. And this is part of the process of why it's taking longer is we're actually looking more closely at these things, and we're trying to learn from our U.S. modeling experience and apply some of that internationally. One of the other areas that we have done that is on the industrial side. I mentioned during the remarks that industrial consumption, particularly in oil, is going to be very important. And one of the things that we're trying to do is to use some of our experience in modeling industrial energy use, residential energy use, and commercial, in these big U.S. things that we do, the CBEX Commercial Building Energy Consumption Survey, the Manufacturing Energy Consumption Survey, Residential Energy Consumption Survey. We're trying to use that experience to inform what we're doing on the international side, and that's one of the other areas, Guy, and others. Okay, so let me go over here. Paul, this is the Canadian question.
No,
it's not.
We're in the OECD. Paul Connors, Canadian Embassy. Adam, thank you to you and your team for getting this report out. We look forward to it. If my recollection from 2 years ago is correct, and it may not be, what struck me in the slides is the growth in energy consumption you're seeing in OECD countries. What I recall from 2 years ago, we talked about effectively all the growth in global consumption was going to be non-OECD, with growth in OECD being just slight and not terribly robust. So if I'm right that we're now saying that it's growing a little stronger in OECD than we thought 2 years ago, I'm wondering what the metrics underlining that are that make you think that consumption in OECD, I'm thinking we've got all robust, the rich countries have robust energy efficiency policy, we're doing more and more efforts on carbon, etc. So I'm just wondering what might be driving that.
So this, good question, and thank you. And it wasn't. It wasn't that. I tell people that EIA does not have an opinion on. I do come from Pennsylvania, the Keystone State, but I don't have an opinion on pipeline infrastructure questions. If you look at these numbers, it's kind of interesting. It does drift up. I mean, we go from 200 and 40 Qs to 290 Qs over that time period. But the percentage shares drop. So the growth rate, obviously, in the non-OECD countries is exceeding that in the OECD. Why does it go up in the OECD? There's probably, I suspect, I don't know that this was in there, but I suspect that the OECD will actually get a little bit bigger. We have Mexico and Chile in there now, just an example. I don't know that we've built that in. John Conte wants to come in and say why we have some growth in the United States. For example, we have total energy consumption actually rising in the U.S. And why does that happen? Because population growth and GDP.
Right, so I would just echo that exactly. It's GDP growth in OECD, and it's population growth. And as you can say, it's not growing all that fast, but it is still growing. And so it's more than we thought it would grow. I don't think not in a significant way. It might be a little bit more, but not much.
So Linda's got pages over there of what's in the models, and she says not too much, not too much. One of the other interesting things, as long as nobody's asked the question, but we have the same, this definitional issue of I'm sure we kept OECD the same. We do the same thing for OPEC, by the way. OPEC membership changes from time to time, and we try to take whatever the current membership is and then work that backwards and work that forwards so that we're not changing the mix of who belongs to what, but there is some flexibility in both of those numbers. Yes, ma'am.
Jenny Mandel with Energy Wire. Two questions that relate more to the modeling. One, can you talk a little bit about why the baseline is 2012?
Why is the baseline 2012? Okay.
And second, the data from between then and now, is that in some cases historical data, or is that all projections based on the 2012 baseline data according to the model?
Right, okay.
So like when we see a 2014 number.
Like
sometimes.
is anything between 2012 and 2015, or the first 4 months of 2016 in those numbers? A little bit. So first of all, why is 2012 the base? And I think the answer to that is, particularly in an international energy outlook, the 2012 numbers are probably going to be a much more accurate reflection of what's really happening than estimates that you would have for 2015, which would be the possible alternative. Even the folks, other people that do this, kind of have the same issues associated with trying to pick a base year where you're confident in the statistics. Would we have informed any of this kind of start period with things that have happened between 2012 and when we began to lock the models down about a year ago? And I think the answer is yes. And John Conte is going to tell you more.
Something really short to that is, so for example, in the United States, we have actual data and STIO projections through 2015. And for certain countries, we'll take the last historical information. But it's 2012 basis because that's the last data point we have all historical data for all parts of the world. So we have more current information than that. It's not just model estimates.
So that comes up all the time. It's one of the reasons why EIA has been putting an emphasis on, like, today in energy, not yesterday in energy, or last year. We could have done last year in energy, but, would you actually read that email? So I get your question. It's really hard. So you're struggling with the accuracy of the data and other issues, timeliness. So there's like three big things in data collection: accuracy, timeliness, and cost. And the joke that data people like to talk about is you can have any two of those three. Right. And so it becomes an issue. So we're trying, in the U.S. numbers, we're trying really, really hard to make sure that the AEO, in fact, we have algorithms built into the annual energy outlook for the U.S. now that try to force convergence into a recent year. So when we do the 2016 AEO, we'll have a really pretty good 2015 base, Guy.
Yeah, I mean, since you bring up those three things, accuracy, timeless, and cost, for especially non-OECD, and you got the perfect slide up there. Well, so if you were asked what degree of confidence you would have in the outcome, given the data issues, given the base year issue of you're already 3 years of, would you assign a significant difference in degree of confidence in the longer term numbers for non-OECD than the OECD?
Right. So the data is definitely better in the OECD countries, and it's improving in the non-OECD. The International Energy Agency, where Guy spent a lot of time, struggles with the same set of issues. The Saudis have Saudi Arabia has actually worked very hard to sponsor something called JODI, Joint Organization Data Initiative, to try to improve the timeliness and accuracy of statistics in the non-OECD countries. So it's an effort that's underway in a lot of places. So this actually leads me to a confession. So when I came into EIA, I came from a private sector job where tomorrow in energy was what they were looking for, not even today. And so I was a little skeptical about the value of long-term forecasting, particularly given, I think, Guy, your very accurate characterization that there's probably a lot of flex in these numbers, right? So does that mean that we are wasting taxpayer dollars doing it? I mean, that's a fair question, right? So, and the answer, I think, the answer is no. It's a combination of we're not wasting, and so, but wait a minute, you just admitted that you don't have a huge amount of confidence in what those endpoint numbers are. And in fact, I listed for you, like all of the things that are going to go wrong. We're going to have the wrong economic numbers. We're not going to get the climate policies thing right. The technology, something is going to happen with batteries in the year 2030 that we didn't expect, that we didn't build into this. Something is going to happen, in Iraq. We know that there are a lot of social issues in Iraq, and maybe Iraqi production isn't going to be as robust as we had thought. It's a possibility. So that actually, now I'm leading you towards the answer to why this is still valuable to do. Because you have a reference case, you say it's existing law and regulation or something as close as you can get to that in an international basis. And then you run those numbers, and then you use that to test. You say, let's think about a different scenario. Let's think about a scenario where the Middle East doesn't produce as much oil as we thought it would have to do in the year 2040. Let's do a scenario that says economic growth is higher or lower than what we think. Let's do one that says oil prices or energy prices are different than the one, and we can see the delta, the difference between the reference case and what those other cases are. And we do that in the AEO. We're trying to do a little more of that in the IEO, and then that is hugely valuable. It's hugely valuable to policymakers. It's hugely valuable to the public to try to understand what doing things or what changing assumptions means to the numbers. Because what you might find is you change an assumption, it doesn't change it very much, right? So that tells you something. Or you change an assumption and it makes a big difference, and that gives you another story. David.
Thanks. David Goldwyn, kudos on the presentation and this period of innovation under your tenure too, the drilling productivity and other things. It's really been remarkable. My question is about China and Canada. Because you were pretty bullish on gas supply in both places, and both those countries have had some serious issues either with geology or framework or moving gas out. And you didn't pick Bolivia and Venezuela, which have big resources, to be big producers.
Right.
So can you talk a little bit about the assumptions of what's going to change in China and Canada to enable them to be big gas producers? And is that change in the back half of your projection, or is that closer to the front?
So, John Staub, were you listening? What can you say about China and Canada in terms of shale gas, and maybe even oil? We are seeing some interesting movement on the oil side, David, in Argentina. Colombia has some interesting possibilities. Poland didn't get as far as a lot of people thought they were going to do in Europe. China is very important. We have a lot of natural gas growth in China, and John Staub is going to tell you about that.
So, Adam, I wanted to add that I noticed also that the CTL numbers looked lower this time than the last IEO, and I don't know if John's the right person on that as well.
So the gas liquids numbers and even, right, are lower. That's mostly a function of the near-term oil price lower, but
Right.
back to technology and geology in China.
Right. So infrastructure plays a large role in thinking about where shale development is going to happen next and where the possibilities are. A lot of the resources in China are fairly close to existing more traditional types of production of oil and gas. And so similarly in Argentina, that's one of the bigger prospects for tight oil development internationally right now outside of the U.S. and Canada. Certainly there's resources in many parts of the world, but infrastructure really plays a large role in that for one, having pipelines and the market for supplying drill bits and rigs, the cost of moving U.S. employees internationally to go with the rigs, because that's often what happens. That makes it much more expensive, and so sometimes you'll see estimates of drilling shale wells in China, 3 times what it costs in the U.S., and that's part of the reason there. China is they do have some drilling rig manufacturers that are working at developing the equipment that's necessary to do this. China's had more challenges in some of their provinces with just stress issues. So the drill pipes get bent because of the way the geology forces play out there. But there's a lot of gas out there. And so if you think about the opportunities, there's going to be more gas development globally.
Let me just add that it makes for an interesting alternative case. If you can't get as much shale, tight gas, coal bed methane development outside of the United States as is built into our forecast, then you're going to need something else. Prices would have to be higher. That might encourage more renewables, so we would have faster growth in renewables. It could also lead to more nuclear or more coal. I mean, I guess that's going to depend on what climate policies look like. One thing that David mentioned in his introduction, let me just I'll try to do this short. He mentioned the DPR, the Drilling Productivity Report. That actually goes back to the earlier question about timeliness of data. When I first got the EIA in June of 2012, the IEO for the annual energy, the U.S. annual energy outlook for 2013 was already locked down, right? The assumptions were made, the models were cranked, and we were doing the write-up. So it was already in the oven. I didn't get to play with the recipe. And we had forecasts in the AEO for oil production for the United States, all the way out to the year 2035, I think at the time, and we wanted to make sure that we had a really good starting year, And I think the starting year ended up being 2011 maybe. It wasn't even 2012 because that was the most accurate data. You remember this was the period, 2010, 11, and 12, when oil production in the United States was rising at something like 1 million barrels a day a year from this revolution in drilling and well completions. So we published the early edition of the 2013 Outlook in December of 2012, and by January we had oil production for the United States was already 500,000 barrels a day too low. Right, so I called everybody together and I said, so look, I've been wrong so many times in my career. I want to admit to you that I have been wrong on many occasions, but I try really hard to not be wrong right away. You know you're going to be wrong. I mean, you take that as a given. So what you want to do is you want to try to make sure that just right out of the starting gate that you don't stumble, right? So we had a stumble. So we got everybody together and I said, well, what was the problem? Well, one problem was we were relying on growth rates that were too low because we were looking at 2010, 2011 and not what was happening in 2012 and going into 2013. And so we invented the drilling productivity report that could look at these shale areas, Eagle Ford, Permian Basin, Niobrara, the Bakken, the Marcellus, the Utica, so that we would have a better, that's where all of the growth was, and in fact, that's now where the declines are coming, largely, so that we would have a much better idea of what was happening in the near term that would then inform our starting point for these things. We're trying to do that and get better at it, and we've actually, I think EIA, that was homegrown. That was invented by Joseph Lefkowski in John Conte's shop. It's been a huge improvement in kind of the setting the starting points for some of these forecasts so that we get better accuracy. Somebody else here. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Adam. Jan Mayers, Resources for the Future. You said that you would be, in your outlook, you will be doing some alternative cases like you've done earlier. Will some of those include a variety of the climate policies that might evolve over the next 25 years?
We probably won't do that we have the IEOs already out, so there's some variations that are discussed in there, not on climate. We'll probably look at that. I mean, we've been asked, well, how much of Paris is included in this IEO, and how is that going to look going forward? So that's a complicated question, and I said, let me see if I can't tell you how that is dealt with. The IEO models are generally regional aggregates, so we don't have every specific country. The Paris Agreement is really kind of a remarkable event, more than 150 countries, a lot of pledges made. It was signed last month on Earth Day. It's very different in many ways than prior climate agreements, but we don't specifically address every individual country. The second thing is these nationally determined contributions. Some of them are already part of existing law and regulation, and they will be built in. But not all of them are part of existing law and regulation. But as they solidify, we will do that. The U.S. Clean Power Plan was not part of the IEO because reference case because we based it on the 2015 AEO, but we tried in the slides that I showed you, we tried to show you where it mattered, how it would change things. The Clean Power Plan will be part of the reference case for the 2016 Annual Energy Outlook. Some of the Paris Agreement NDCs are non-energy related. Some of them, notably in Brazil, Canada, Australia, there are a lot of land use and forestry contributions, and those don't change the energy picture, and so you'd have to be careful there. And then the final thing that I would say about the NDCs is that there's a very wide variety of approaches that were taken by a huge number of countries, and the terminology is different, and the time frames are different. Absolute reductions, reductions from business as usual, reductions in energy intensity, peaking targets. China has peaking targets, and we've tried to build those in, actually, though they are built into the IEO. Policy actions, so it's complicated, but we'll work our way through that, and in the next IEO, we'll probably have more to say, and I suspect that we'll try to look at what some of these things mean. In the same way that we're looking at the U.S. Clean Power Plan, what does it look like if it's in? What does it look like if it's not in? We'll try to think our way through some of that on an international basis. Thank you, Jan, and thank you for your long-term support of EIA and our independence. Thank you. In the back here.
Yeah, Ken Meyercord, Wildox. With regard to your observation that the old terms conventional and non-conventional production don't really apply very well these days, would the terms cheap versus expensive production be more accurate and instructive?
I love the question, but I'm not sure that would necessarily be the right way to think about it either. And let me try to explain. I participated, John Guy from the National Petroleum Council is here this morning. And John remembers back in 2007 that there was this big study done by the National Petroleum Council, the hard truths, and it looked at a lot of these issues in the United States and globally in the energy area, and particularly on petroleum and natural gas. Now, there was not a lot in the hard truths about shale. Now, we knew about shale. It wasn't like nobody knew in 2007 about shale. Because it was, people were working on that, and the Barnett shales were being drilled, and people understood that. So how does it come back to your question? And the answer is high cost versus lower cost. In 2007, shale looked like it was the high cost resource, and that other, that conventional gas, whether it was in Canada or the United States or Russia, looked like the lower cost gas, and maybe even some of the resources in the Middle East, for example, big gas producing countries over there, Iran. So when you think about that, what really the revolution that occurred in shale in the United States was not that we didn't know about it. It was that it went from being the high cost version to the lower cost version. So shale, break even points, and now I'm scared to death. I've opened up a can of worms with that. But break-even points in shale probably went from $10. It was going to cost you $10 a million BTUs to get it out of the ground, to you can probably do it at $2 or $3 a million BTUs, and so I'm not sure that I would want to characterize it as high cost, low cost, because I think that the technology and the learning curve on that is still a very remarkable event. Sarah has a question.
Oh,
no. Well, go. Yes, you first, and then.
Yes,
your name's not Sarah.
No, it's not. I'm Maya Weber with Platts. I had a question about your projections for shares for gas, renewables, nuclear, et cetera. I was just wondering if you can comment on how that may have shifted from your last outlook. Are there any major changes in what you had seen before? Is there anything that stands out as looking different this time around?
Right. So how do we have more renewables than we did in the last outlook? Because costs have continued to fall. And we are still looking at that. We are examining all of the assumptions that we've been making in the renewables area, and particularly for things like wind and solar. And we're looking at those cost curves and what can actually be delivered and what the constraints are on transmission lines and so on from having intermittent sources and how that can be offset and so on. We're taking a look at all of that, but the answer is we've ended up with more renewables this time than the last. We probably would have even had more if oil prices had remained at higher levels. Because the lower oil prices also lowered the natural gas price, and natural gas and renewables are competing. So there will be, you will actually be able to look at that. You'll be able to look at the old. So one of the things that we do at EIA is we don't wipe out the older studies. They're still on our servers, and they're easily available. And you can, with one of the other things that we innovated, you can get a lot of our data downloaded into your own spreadsheet and do the comparison. Sometimes we do that for you. We make it pretty easy, and you'd be able to look at the differences in the different years. Okay, Sarah, back to you.
Thanks, Sarah Ladislaw here, the CSIS Energy and National Security Program. Thanks so much, Adam, for doing this, and I just joined the chorus of applause for all the dedication you guys bring to sort of pushing the ball forward on what is a really difficult but important task, especially given everything we're going through in the energy sector. So we have the luxury of knowing what an expert you are in the oil sector and sort of broader economic and finance issues. So I thought one of the things I wanted to know is, what we're hearing about a lot recently is whether or not the broader economy is going through some sort of structural shift, right? We're using a lot of stimulus to drive growth, and stimulus-driven growth might be less energy intensive than, other sort of more organic, productivity-oriented gains. And then on the other hand, there's this real question about whether in the oil market in particular, supply elasticities and demand elasticities have changed fundamentally, right? And then there's this question about how finance sort of, works its way into the oil and gas sector and how that is changing. I know you can't model that, right, over up to 2040, but how do you weigh those sort of foundational issues of relationships between economic growth and supply and demand elasticities? And just from your personal perspective, we won't take this, as the IEO view necessarily, but how are those sorts of things changing, and why would that be important for an outlook that goes out to 2040?
Right. So I thought I kind of heard there at the end, Adam, just give us your personal opinion. So I recall, Sarah, and I didn't ask you to do this, but Frank Verastro, when he introduced me back in 2013, I think when we were doing this, said, Adam is just one policy comment away from returning to his private sector job. And there's another thing, and this is actually kind of, to me, it's sort of interesting. It's one of the things that a lot of federal employees take very seriously. There's something called the Hatch Act. Now that has to do with, campaign issues and so on. But behind the Hatch Act, there's like a really interesting thing. Let me tell you about it. It's to me, it's interesting. Is what they say is if you're a political appointee like I am, and you're Senate confirmed, that you don't have personal opinions anymore. You are on 24/7 as the head of EIA. And so I'm going to answer as the head of EIA. I just got done reading. I actually read. It took me 2 weeks to read a book that's 750 pages long, Robert Gordon. It's called The Rise and Fall of American Growth. And what Gordon said, this goes to your first question, Sarah, about GDP, and is something going on in the U.S. and globally that might be changing differences. Gordon's argument is that there is something going on that's different, and we're going to see a slower growth period over this period out to 2040 because a lot of the things that drove extraordinary growth in the period from the late 1800s to 1950 You know, if you thought about that period from World War I to World War II even, to narrow it, are going to be hard to repeat. And he went through some of, I think it's really interesting, and it has energy applicability. So what were the things that happened in this period from the late 1800s is the electrification in the U.S. and in many cases globally, the invention of the internal combustion engine and how that dramatically, the combination of electricity and internal combustion engine dramatically changed life in cities, making, you know, less pollution. I mean, you know, he had literally, everybody remembers the story about how much horse manure there was going to be in the major cities. And because of the car, that problem got solved. Electricity meant that you could have refrigeration, you could have, it made telephonics possible, so you could have telephones, you could have TV, you could have the internet, the water and sewer. I started out as a civil engineer. Civil engineers are very proud of their role and, you know, over time and improving the quality of life simply by being able to get clean water into homes and dirty water back out again and keeping them separated. Right, so that was like a huge thing, and he's kind of gone. His thesis is that what the next big huge thing is going to be? Is it going to be artificial intelligence? Is it the internet? Is it something else? And he looks at those things and he's struggling to try to say how you're going to repeat that. I see, you know, he actually calls his critics techno-optimists, so technology optimists. And raise your hand if you're a technology optimist. I am. I mean, I think that we probably haven't seen the end of improvements in technology, that somebody is going to come up with something, that we are going to continue to see improvements in GDP. And he doesn't try to make this argument for the world. I mean, I think that the application of these things, transportation technologies. It doesn't have to be the internal combustion engine. It might be electricity. It might be something else. But in transportation, in places like the Middle East and Africa, electrification, you know, sewer and water. There were some interesting stories I heard on NPR this morning about the river systems in India and how dreadfully challenged they are with clean water, and that could make a huge difference in people's lives, and I think it's going to happen. You know, are we in a temporarily slow growth period? I think some of this is a hangover from the 2007, 8, 9 kind of run up and crash, and that we're still struggling with ways to deal with that, both in Europe and the U.S., maybe even in China. But I don't think we're down for the count. Elasticities of supply and demand, really kind of hard to do. One of the problems, and I don't have a prop up here, you know, the typical elasticities of supply and demand with respect to price charts that you see in the Economics 101 textbooks are these kind of shallow curves where a little change in price changes supply or changes demand. And all you need to do to understand a lot about oil and energy is take that chart and turn it 90 degrees, and the supply and demand elasticities in energy, and particularly in oil, are really steep. It takes a lot of change in price to drive changes in supply and changes in demand, and that's why I think we see a lot of the volatility. There was this hope that shale might actually have flattened those elasticity curves on the supply side, but you know, maybe it's worked and maybe it hasn't, and that's a much bigger issue we could have a workshop on and talk about. The final thing that I would say in answer to your question is geopolitics. Geopolitics is really difficult. We kind of got at that in unrest in producing countries. Let me just say Venezuela. Venezuela is producing 3 million barrels a day of oil, 800,000 or 900,000 barrels a day that is coming to the United States. The Venezuelan economy is in horrible, horrible shape. The possibilities of something going wrong in Venezuela are very high, and there isn't a whole lot of spare capacity around the world these days. Nobody on the oil side, and so these are issues that I think that policy people need to be thinking about and looking for ways to deal with. Okay, we have we have no time. Actually, do we want to do one last question? Who wants the last question? Yes, sir, in the back.
So I'm very curious, is your organization looking at any illegal crude oil exports? Because right now it's banned, but given Texas and Louisiana are the closest to Mexico and Mr. Trump's comments on illegal stuff, according to that, are you
Exporting crude
looking at
oil,
any
right.
data according in that?
Are we going to have, right. Thank you. I'm glad I took that last question. Yes. So the question was, the U.S. has changed the rules now. So we no longer restrict crude oil exports. We never actually had a ban. Canada, we could always export crude oil to Canada, and there were a few other, that was a big exception, and there were some other minor exceptions. But now, U.S. crude oil can go anywhere with very few exceptions, you know, countries on a terrorism list, that kind of thing. Is the U.S. going to be exporting more crude oil? I think on a yes, that there will be that done on an opportunistic basis, opportunistic in the sense of, do you have a market for it? Is it the right kind of oil to go somewhere? And what does that mean? I have noticed, for example, that we've already peaked in the near term anyways. We went from about 50,000 barrels a day of oil going to Canada to close to 500,000 barrels a day, and that number is now coming down because the spreads have changed. The difference between Brent prices and West Texas Intermediate prices has narrowed. It's not as attractive to export. But I think that oil will become just another one of the tradable commodities. And generally speaking, where exports like to go is to the nearest possible market that can use it. That's why oil did want to go to Canada. I suspect that we'll see exports to places like Mexico and maybe elsewhere. We're actually sending some crude oil to Venezuela, believe it or not, because that light sweet crude oil from the Permian Basin and Eagle Ford is a really attractive kind of crude oil to go into the refinery kit that they have in Venezuela. So there are going to be lots of opportunities to do that. Probably not as much need to do that now that the spreads have narrowed and now that oil prices are a little bit lower, because what we're seeing is U.S. production is slowing down, but U.S. petroleum demand is continuing to go up a little bit, certainly in the short term here. And as a result, we're importing a little bit more oil, so we don't have as much of a need to export. And I think it's kind of interesting because that question actually brought us full circle to the first few questions that were being asked about LNG. And some of the same things. Because of lower oil prices, we're probably going to have not quite as much LNG in those projections. But keep in mind, the 25-year projection is a long term. And for those of you who are unsatisfied with my LNG answer, Angelina LaRose, who's now running the international office at EIA, prior to that was doing a lot of our work on liquefied natural gas and global natural gas markets, and she would be delighted to answer your questions. And I'm delighted to thank you for your really good questions, to thank CSIS again, Guy, and Sarah and Frank. I really, EIA in general, really appreciates the opportunity to do this with CSIS and their community. And thank you very much for your attention today.
Thanks. Thanks, everybody. Thank you.